naman dyan nananalo eh. Kaya itong mga emergency measures na sinasabi, parang palamuti na lang at parang consuelo de bobo, pagkat hindi naman nagagamit, hindi naman napapanalunan.
Sa naging pagdinig ng subcommittee na binuo para talakayin ang Rcep ay hindi yata namalayan ni Senator Mig Zubiri na nadulas ang kanyang dila at tila ay lumalabas na kaya pala niya pinagdidikdikang madaliin ang pagratipika sa Rcep ay meron siyang kinakausap na kumpanya at dinala pa niya dito sa Pilipinas. Ito ba kaya ang dahilan kung bakit atat na atat ang senador para ratipikahin ang Rcep? Samantalang si Senator Imee Marcos ay patuloy pa rin ang kanyang pagkikipaglaban na makakasama ito sa ating bansa, lalo na sa ating mga magsasaka. Paano nadulas si Senator Mig Zubiri at paano nilamon ng katalinuhan ni Manang Imee ang nasabing senador? Bago natin ipagpatuloy ang detalye ay mapapansin na habang nagsasalita at nagpapaliwanag si Senator Loren Legarda ay tila walang pakialam itong Senator Mig Zubiri at nag-cellphone na lang ito. Bigla din siyang tumayo sa kanyang upuan at makikitang tila ay distracted din ang senadora at pilit na inaayos ang upuan at hinahawakan para tumigil sa paggalaw. Samantala kapansin-pansin naman ang mga mannerism ni Senator Imee Marcos sa kanyang mga kamay. Ito ay nagpapakita na kumukulo na ang kanyang dugo sa pinagdadaldal ni Mig Zubiri, pero naging profesional pa rin siya sa bandang huli. Panoorin natin kung paano nadulas si Mig Zubiri sa diskusyon na ito. Lumalabas na ba ito na si Mig Zubiri ay panig sa interes ng malalaking kumpanya? Samantalang si Imee Marcos ay kapakanan ng mga maliliit na negosyante at magsasaka ang ipinaglalaban nito.
And I introduced you last week with a company that wants to build 2,000 e-vehicles. It's an EVT company. It's the biggest e-vehicle company listed in the NASDAQ. Their choice is between Singapore, Johor, or the Philippines. Singapore, why? Because the headquarters in Singapore, the manufacturing will be in Johor. And they held on to the contract signing because they wanted to visit the Philippines. And I brought them here last week. Obviously, it would be more advantageous for them to go to Singapore, Johor if we do not join the Rcep. Because they also want to sell these vehicles within the Rcep regions, not only the United States.
Sa bandang huli naman ng isinagawang diskusyon ay tila ba biglang naging mabait si Mig Zubiri at tila ay nagpapakitang bigla ng kanyang concern sa agriculture sector.
The issue of agriculture, Mr. President, marami talagang problema ng agrikultura. Marami talaga. From the lack of inputs, the lack of know-how, the lack of training, the lack of modernization of our equipments and machineries, even land concerns. Kasi overlapping po yung issues on land dyan sa agriculture.
Narito naman ang ilang bahagi ng mga maiinit na pahayag at opinyon ni Senator Imee Marcos na buong tapang na ipinagtanggol ang kapakanan ng mga maliliit nating mga magsasaka at mga maliliit na negosyante.
In fact, questions remain in my mind, as well as they do in many others. And first, I wowould like to state, quoting the Senate President, that international bodies and organizations such as the ADB, the World Bank, the UNCTAD have recognized the immense value and importance of the Rcep, especially in the post-pandemic recovery. However, it should be observed that the UNCTAD itself, in a research paper by Dr. Nishita, indicated that tariff concessions under the Rcep will result in lower exports by the Philippines, completely the opposite claim by the administration. The study shows that the overall effect of Rcep will be a decrease in Philippine exports by $100 million. In another study by Boston University, Rashmi Banga et al., it was shown that Philippine exports will decline by 0.2% and imports would rise by 0.2% at the very least. Even with the sensitive lists of tariff rate quotas, as mentioned by our colleague in the annexes, by Senator Chis Escudero, the paper estimated that the Philippines' balance of trade in goods will deteriorate by a minimum of 1.1% or a loss of USD 260 million per annum. So it will get quite a bit worse before it gets any better. All these losses on top of an estimated $58 million in tariff revenue losses annually. Are these figures accurate? Do you have any comment? Because I know the DTI, the DA, and the other economic managers' projections are different.
Well, Your Honor, first of all, good afternoon, Your Honor. Mr. President. Mr. President, I always say the proof in the pudding is in the eating. Diba? All these studies were made prior to RCEP's ratification on all these other countries. But we have seen in the region, Mr. President, I mentioned it yesterday and in my speech last week, exports in RCEP countries increased, particularly Vietnam, 16.4% with a total value of $108 billion. Nag-increase. And you know, we're trying to catch up with Vietnam because parang Vietnam is now our peg when we try to get foreign direct investments from other countries. It's always either the Vietnam or Philippines ang gusto nilang puntahan.
The truth is they can't all be credited to RCEP. It means simply that we are trading more actively with our neighbors here in ASEAN. As an example, China-Philippines bilateral trade increased by 8.3% during the first 11 months of 2022, a clear recovery from the pandemic. We were not members of RCEP, but that uptick was very clear-cut. Philippine exports to South Korea increased by 16.9% again during the same period of the first 3 quarters of 2022, where in fact both South Korea and China are RCEP members, and still the Philippines was not. In fact, our increase in trade was greater than these examples stated of Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam without RCEP.
But Madam President, just to Mr. President, let's go to the flip side. The flip side is if we don't join RCEP and we stay isolationist in this region, you think the people that we talked to in Japan last weekend with the president, your brother, will they want to go to the Philippines and expand their trade here?
Raise the following questions by way of manifestation that the sponsors may or may not answer. We are repeatedly told everywhere we go that we are the last country to ratify this trade agreement, this treaty. However, the reality is, at the outset, a major economy refused to even join the discussion. Is it not a fact that India did not join RCEP precisely because of concerns similar to ours here in the Philippines on threats of circumvention of rules of origin, issues of trade deficit, and the potential flood of imported goods? We share the same problems with India, except they're much bigger and they're much stronger. And what about that growing trade deficit? Not projected, but actually recorded already in several countries. This is a major concern po. I would also like to mention that a statement was made by the sponsors that adequate safety nets are provided in the agreement to cover unwarranted or exceptional circumstances. May I simply say that these supposedly sufficient safeguards are no safeguards at all, simply because the success rate for successfully defending Article 20 of the GATT and the Article 14 of the GATT, the Services Agreement, is less than 3%. A study in 2015 reveals that out of 43 cases involving Article 20 of GATT and Article 14 of GATT, only one was successful. Wala naman dyan nananalo eh. Kaya itong mga emergency measures na sinasabi, parang palamuti na lang at parang consuelo de bobo, pagkat hindi naman nagagamit, hindi naman napapanalunan. Ito nga ang kinatatakutan natin. Meron tayong Senate resolution on the concurrence of RCEP, including measures and instructions to government agencies in an attempt to provide additional safety nets to the vulnerable sectors, particularly the agricultural sector. Ito nga, ang problema. Nakita natin sa rice tarification law, may fund na sinasabi. Yet studies show that the income of farmers fell by 40%. How do we ensure that the measures indicated will indeed protect the vulnerable sectors? Ito nga ang mga problema natin. May bisa ba talaga itong mga safety nets na to? Ginagamit ba natin ng madalas? At talaga bang may epekto? Yan ang tanong ko. At I would also like to put on record the reported conclusion that there are great potential gains for the Philippine agricultural sector. It is not clear how the sector can capitalize on these potential gains, given the sorry state of agriculture in this country. Presently, we're struggling to provide basic agricultural services that were promised as early as 1994 with the WTO. Hanggang ngayon, in the last 10 years, ang compounded annual growth rate of irrigated areas is only 2%. We cannot deliver the basic services. Do we really believe we can deliver the services necessary to make our farmers capitalize and transform into competitive partners in whatever Rcep has to offer? In addition, a good bulk of the potential exports of Philippine agricultural products will be destined for China. Given the recent moves by our government, which China has specifically already manifested their disappointment with the additional EDCA sites, is it realistic to project that China will be buying all our durians? We're already witness to what has happened in the last few years with the Australia-China trade wars. Is this what we want to happen? And also, realistically, the peak of the fruit bearing for durian is not tomorrow. It's after 10 to 15 years. Our Senate President knows that very well. He comes from Mindanao. And I believe that we should not make these promises simply because we will be fraught to fulfill them. Also, it is claimed that the Rcep will benefit the MSMEs due to a platform called Rcep SME that institutionalizes support and cooperation for them to be integrated in the great global production chain. The truth is, Article 14 of Rcep, the single article pertaining to MSMEs, uses very vague, non-committal words such as encouraging MSMEs, promoting, exploring. By these provisions, are we certain that best practices in trade will in fact be engendered? Is there a sanction? Will they be punished if they don't do this? This is a concern. Lastly, and as I said, I have no desire to torment my peers, most especially my Honorable Senate President, but the proponents of Rcep have stated that joining the trade agreement will result in an increase in electronic exports. But will these reports of electronic exports increases really defray the thousands of jobs already lost in the electronic companies leaving the country due to incentive and other infrastructure concerns? How confident is the DTI at the end of the day that electronic exports will increase due to Rcep, given the reported closures of electronic firms, not only here in Southern Tagalog, but also in MEPSA and other places throughout the country? We are also aware of the loss of jobs everywhere in many of these areas. These are my concerns, and I am grateful to the President, to the majority, for allowing me to put them on record. The sponsors may or may not reply as necessary, but I have to put them on record for the concerned sectors. Thank you very much.